everybody. The topic of this unit is mystics and reformers, mainly in the 16th century. And we will be looking at the mystics first in this video, then moving on to women's engagement in the Protestant Reformation in the next couple of videos. So this video is focused on mysticism, specifically women's engagement with mysticism and mystical theology. This has long been an area of Christianity in which women were highly engaged, which is why I'm choosing to start here. In addition, for this unit, you are reading an excerpt from Teresa of Avila's book, The Interior Castle, and this video should give you some context for that reading as well. So we need to start with a very basic question here before I go any further, and that is, what is Christian mysticism? This is the definition that I have up on the screen. This is the definition I use in my mysticism course. An intimate and experiential relationship set within a Christian framework with the triune God. There's also a sense of spiritual progress in the term that needs to be acknowledged. However, if I am just looking at medieval and early modern mystics, I may choose to define it differently. And that would be what you see now: purgation, illumination, and union. This is a process, basically. Purgation is the process of understanding and purifying yourself of sins. Illumination is the process of understanding God. And union, while there's different understandings of this term, is connecting to God. I could talk a lot about what mystical union is, but I think that's a little bit more than we need to do right now. If you just think of it as an intimate moment with God, basically. I think that's good enough for here. All right, so this process of purgation, illumination, and union dominates medieval thought. And Teresa does fall into this framework. Why I don't use this definition in my mysticism class is that early mystics, especially like the desert mystics, and modern mystics largely don't fit into this framework. But that's neither here nor there. Regardless, mysticism usually has some sort of close relationship with God and an element of progress in the holy life. Now, up on the screen, I have a list of some really well-known mystics, Anthony, Bernard, Hildegard, Eckhart, Catherine, Julian, Teresa, John of the Cross, Lima, Rosa de Lima, George Fox. All right. Now, I want to spend a moment discussing mysticism and gender here. There's actually been a ton written about the role of gender in Christian mysticism. Mysticism is one area where there's just consistently been a lot of women producing works, especially from the High Middle Ages on. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. A full analysis is probably not possible, but I do want to highlight a couple things here. All right. Throughout most history, women were largely denied access to both formalized church leadership roles and more formal educational opportunities. There are exceptions to this, of course. Women did have leadership opportunities within monastic communities often, and they were more educated in monasteries as well. However, women were denied leadership within church hierarchies, and especially in this early early modern period. And even wealthy women rarely had the educational opportunities that a man would have. Therefore, theology was largely written by men for other men. And especially because they wrote in Latin, a lot of women couldn't even read these texts. Mystics, on the other hand, did not necessarily gain their authority from earthly institutions. Often they claimed their authority came directly from God. When a woman wrote about her mystical experiences, she was speaking from her own experiences. However, you can read these texts and discover really robust theologies. To sum things up, mystical writings were a way in which women could legitimately write theology. This is not to say that their experiences were not genuine. I suspect that most of them were, but it was a legitimate, and fairly accepted way for women to be scholars in this time period. And that brings us to Teresa of Avila. I'm going to give you a short introduction to her and her context, and then give you a little information about the interior castle. I used to assign the whole book, but I cut it down to an excerpt, especially because I decided to assign her autobiography in my mysticism class. Without question, she is one of my favorite figures in Christian history. Not only was she a mystic, a reformer, a talented writer, but she seemed like a pretty fun person. She was born in 1515. To relate that to the wider world, she was 2 years old when Martin Luther nailed up his 95 Theses. She, of course, knew of Luther. She mentions him in her writings. But it's unlikely she ever had access to any of his writings or read anything of his. This is also, she was born about 20 years after the Spanish first reached the Americas. And we'll be talking about Latin America next week, but this is sort of in the background in her life. Also going on was the very active Inquisition. It was very, very zealous during her lifetime. Its presence is significant and it plays a role in her life. Some of her favorite books were banned. Some people she knew were charged with heresy. It wasn't a distant thing. She was dealing with this. As a young woman, she decided to join the Carmelite order. Who are the Carmelites? Well, they began on Mount Carmel in the 1200s. We know that a small group of Europeans gathered there to live a contemplative life. We don't know a ton about them, except for that they only lived there for a few decades, 100 at the most. And by 1290, they were out of the Holy Land and went back to Europe, and they became a mendicant order, along with, other mendicant orders like the Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians. As a nun, she would not have been a mendicant. She wasn't a wandering nun. Okay. Women's houses were almost always cloistered, though she wasn't cloistered, but women did not wander begging and preaching. Okay. So when she joined the Carmelites, I don't think she had a real passion for being a nun, but I think she thought it sounded better than getting married. And she joined a pretty lax convent. They were not cloistered. She could go and visit friends and family. She had people come and visit her. Basically, becoming a nun did not stop her social life. But eventually she did have this very profound religious experience. She becomes very, very serious about her faith. She starts experiencing miracles, and she becomes this great reformer of the Carmelite order. What she wants to do is bring the order back to its original rule, which the Carmelites wrote in the 1200s. All right, a much more strict rule than what people were following. She ends up founding at least 14 communities. Many of those are still in existence today. Now, a moment on her mysticism, she had many different experiences. She reportedly had visions, ecstasies, levitations, trances, encounters with otherworldly beings. She had intellectual visions, which imparted theological knowledge. She saw Jesus, angels, demons, and the dead. She talks about spending a few moments in hell in her autobiography, and she also had visions of heaven. There are also some reports of her levitating, something she found deeply, deeply embarrassing. All of this activity brought Teresa a good deal of fame, but it also brought concerns and suspicions from the Inquisition. She wrote a few things. First was her Vita, or her autobiography. She was ordered to write this so the church could examine her theology and make sure that it was orthodox. They did deem her visions and her experiences real and her theology orthodox. Second, she wrote a spiritual book in the vernacular for her monastic sisters. This is The Way of Perfection. Basically, all of the vernacular prayer books had been banned by the Inquisition at this point, so she produced this guide for her sisters. And then at the age of 62, she was asked to write about her life again, this time as a sort of spiritual autobiography, and that is The Interior Castle, which you are reading. A few things I want to note about this. She did not want to write this book. She complains a fair amount about writing it through the text. The prologue is basically just her listing all the reasons she didn't want to write it. She wrote the book very, very quickly. There are parts where she quotes scripture or something and she's not sure if it's right, but she's like, I'm not going to go bother and read it. Or she'll be like, I don't know if I talked about this. I'm not going to go back and look and see if I did. All right. Despite this lack of interest in writing the book, it is considered a classic of Spanish literature and Catholic literature. And through the book, she is comparing the soul to a castle with 7 different areas, rooms, or dwellings, as it's called. And at the center is God. While language and metaphor are always inadequate to describe God, this one does a pretty good job, especially because she's always keeping God at the center. As you're reading this, keep in mind it's a work of mysticism. It's also a spiritual guide. She's describing how believers can reach a mystical union with God through prayer. Theologically, you may be on a very different page than Teresa. You know, she was a 16th century nun. You're a Protestant in the 21st century. I don't expect you to be completely on board with everything she has to say, but she does have some really valuable things to say. And it's a really important text, especially one written by a woman in this time period. Okay. All right, that's where I'm going to leave off with Teresa. Next video, we will start talking about the Reformation. Thanks, everybody.